Hello and welcome. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here, but just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Minnesota ghosts from the safety of wherever you're watching this program. So with that, let's begin. My name is Chad Lewis, and I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, reports of UFOs, alien abductions, really weird people, odd places. You name it, if it's just strange and a little bit out there. I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore for this program. Some of Minnesota's most haunted places. For the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to take a tour of the entire state. I'm going to give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of the research we do at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you, whether you're a diehard skeptic or a true believer or somewhere in between, to travel to these places on your own and determine whether or not you believe they're haunted. But I should warn you, a lot of you have probably seen programs on TV about ghosts and hauntings. But it's much different when you're actually there. When you're out in the middle of nowhere and you see that shadowy creature thing lurking from tree to tree, you simply can't change to another channel and forget all about it. So with that in mind, let's explore some of the scariest places Minnesota has to offer. When I mention haunted places, a lot of people will think of a cemetery. The reason being is pretty simple. Back when cemeteries were chosen, the land was thought to serve as a portal between our world and the spirit world. So when your loved one passed on, it would just be easier for them to travel from our world to whatever world you believe they go to. But regardless of whether or not you believe that theory, a lot of places in Minnesota think that the cemetery's working in reverse, that the living are not moving to the spirit, but the dead are moving into our world. If you're looking to go to one haunted cemetery in Minnesota, I recommend you head to Loon Lake Cemetery outside of Jackson. Actually, I recommend you don't go to this cemetery because the locals, they don't call it Loon Lake Cemetery. They call it Witch Cemetery. The legend is many years ago, a young girl by the name of Mary Jane was practicing witchcraft, the dark arts. So the community, in order to stop her from bringing evil spirits to the village, grabbed an axe, chopped off her head, and buried her bloody body and the axe out in a grave at Loon Lake Cemetery. Now, if there's any cemetery that looks like it should be haunted, it's this one. It's in the middle of nowhere. You have to walk about a quarter mile on this makeshift path just to get to the graveyard. And when you do, you'll see that it's in complete disarray, heavily vandalized, run down, and neglected. But the story is that the witch's grave is out here, and that if you find the grave and walk over it or jump over it or merely pass by it, you'll be cursed with bad luck until the day you die. Every year I'd hear from a handful of people who claimed terrible things happened after they found the witch's grave and did the dare. I was so excited when I first went out here 20 plus years ago to take the dare. But the problem is, we don't know which grave is the witch's. Many of the graves are unmarked. The old plat books don't list who's buried where. It's completely disorganized. Mary Jane, the alleged witch, well, her gravestone sits down at the local historical society's museum. There they have it on display because they were afraid somebody was going to steal it. In fact, some claim there may be 3 different witches buried out at Loon Lake Cemetery. But since we don't know where they're actually buried, I advise you to pay attention as to every grave you're walking by, because you never know if it's the witch's grave. Other people have odd experiences out here as well. Weird lights, unknown noises, eerie feelings. But not everyone believes there are witches and ghosts out at Loon Lake Cemetery. Which is why one of the first things you'll see when you get there is this sign saying, "No ghosts or witches exist in the cemetery." But you don't have to take their word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take your own word for it. Because right out in front of the entrance to the cemetery is a small self-registering campground where you can spend the night and decide for yourself. This place is so rural and secluded, nobody will bother you. At least not anyone who's alive. Another one of my favorite cemeteries is near Sanborn, near Lamberton. Now it's the Sanborn Lamberton Cemetery. It's perched high above a hill about 4 miles on the outskirts of town. For decades people have talked about this place as being haunted. Oftentimes people would go out there and see mysterious balls of light similar to these floating through the area, changing in size, shape, and color as they maneuvered their way through the cemetery. But my favorite legend tells of the dare. Just like at Loon Lake Cemetery, a lot of these places have dares attached to them. You have to do something in order for the legend to come true. And the dare out at the Lamberton Cemetery is that if you go out there, and if you're very quiet, and you put your ear to the ground, you will hear the faint cries of a young woman that was said to have been buried alive out at the cemetery. People who hear her claim that she says things like, "Help me, dig me up, save me." Others claim it just sounds more like a baby crying. When the wind's just right, they claim you can hear these sounds all the way into town. When we went there, we brought a ton of recording equipment with us, hoping that while we were there, we would capture these voices coming from the beyond. Unfortunately, while we were there, not a peep. It's a great story, but is it anything more than an urban legend? Was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem a little silly today with modern science and medicine, but our grandparents were so afraid of being buried alive, they came up with several inventions. My favorite is this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell that would sit above your grave with a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke and found yourself buried alive, all you'd have to do is pull that rope, it would ring the bell, and alert the caretaker who lived at the cemetery that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. But there was one problem with this invention though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare thinking everyone had been buried alive. It was actually your responsibility to sit around your grave of your loved one to make sure that they were truly dead and they wouldn't rise up. And speaking of rising up, our next case might just have proof of that. It's the Winona vampire or death siren. It all began in 1922. And it began with the death of Frances Block. Frances Block passed away and was buried out at the cemetery in St. Mary's on the outskirts of Winona. But soon after she died, all of her brothers began dying as well. The family, which lived on the east end of Winona, were very superstitious. Neighbors told him, the father, that the only way he could stop more deaths coming from his family is to go out to the grave, dig up his daughter, and decapitate her and bury her head at the bottom of her gravesite. They believed that the first child in a family to die would act like a death siren, enticing all of its siblings to come to death and meet them. So the only way to stop it was to chop off the head. And believe it or not, that's what the father did. He went out to the graveyard, dug up the grave of his daughter, but then he got cold feet. He could not do it. He placed a cross on her chin and reburied her. The police found out about this. They went out and redug up her body to make sure he had not desecrated the body. And when they dug her up, they found that indeed he had not chopped off her head. The weirdest part is that back in that time period, there were no laws about digging up bodies as long as you didn't harm them. So he was not charged. Others now believe the cemetery is haunted. All kinds of weird paranormal activity seems to take place out there. Now, I've been out there many times, both day and night, looking for the spirit of Frances Block. I've never been attacked by a vampire or the death siren, but then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit wherever I go. But if death sirens aren't scary enough for you, you may want to head right outside of Mankato. This is the mausoleum of Dr. Falman. The place is thought to be haunted for decades. People have gone out to this place and claimed supernatural activity will take place. And we don't know why. The doctor did not die a tragic death. He wasn't a serial killer. He was an upstanding member of the community that died at old age, apparently having lived a good life. So why his story would get turned into a ghostly legend, we have no idea. But people have seen mysterious lights. They've heard odd voices out there. But my favorite part is the dare. And the dare tells that if you go to his gravesite and knock on the door, it will act like some supernatural doorbell. And you will hear not only knocking coming from the inside of the locked crypt, but many claim that your knocking will awake a demon creature, a devil-like monster that will show up and scare you out of the cemetery. I've collected thousands of dares from around the world. I've done hundreds upon hundreds of them. The overwhelming majority of them are bad luck, misfortune, and mishap. It's never anything good that if you do the dare, you'll find true love or win the lottery. So if you do these dares, do them at your own risk. Believe it or not, this is the most commonly asked question I receive. Where can I go to spend the night in a haunted place? Well, if you have that macabre sense of adventure, you're in luck, because in Minnesota, you have all kinds of haunted lodging options. As you saw, from campgrounds to B&Bs, motels, hotels, resorts, and the like. One of my favorite is in Sauk Center. It's the old Palmer House Hotel, world famous for being the boyhood home of novelist Sinclair Lewis. But it's not Sinclair's ghost haunting the place. It seems to be several others, including that of a young boy who is said to be staying at the hotel while receiving medical treatment at a nearby facility. Unfortunately, he did not survive. And now many people have seen his spirit wandering the hotel. Most often he's seen sitting on the steps leading up to the upper floor. People see him only to watch him vanish right before their eyes. Others, while checking out, complained that someone seemed to have let their child bounce a ball through the hallway at all hours of the night. But when they went to look in the hallway, it was completely empty. But what I love about the Palmer house is that unlike other places where maybe one room or one area has a haunted legend, the whole hotel has experiences there, including down at the main bar. Now I know what you're thinking. You can go to any bar in Minnesota and see weird things happen, but if you want them to be paranormal, stop in here. Stools fall over on their own as though pushed by some unseen force. Bottles have moved as though some unseen hand has moved them. Bartenders hear their name being called, but when they spin around, nobody's there. People have ordered a drink and then vanished right into thin air, thought to be a ghostly spirit trying to grab a spirit. It's also up in the rooms a lot of oddities take place. One of my favorite stories comes from a husband and wife, newlyweds, spending their honeymoon at the Palmer. When the wife woke up in the middle of the evening, the room was freezing, even though the air conditioning was not on. She looked down at the edge of the bed just in time to see the ghostly image of a man hovering over her, watching her. He looked like he was dressed from 100 years ago. She immediately woke up her husband, and by the time he woke up, the man had vanished into thin air. But if you're going to stay at the Palmer house, make sure you take a tour of the basement. It's a dark, creepy old basement. Many believe there might be bodies buried underneath there. You can sit in the blackness and determine for yourself. People have seen a lot of the objects move on their own and scuttle across the floor. People have heard odd noises down there, and it's a truly creepy location to visit. Anoka, Minnesota, the Halloween capital of the world, and they might just have more hauntings than any other city as well. This is one of my favorite places. It's Billy's Bar and Grill, but it's the old Jackson Hotel, one of the earliest hotels in the area, the site of the first murder in the area. It was once an old brothel, a speakeasy, a place where all of the railroad workers, along with the lumberjacks, could go and spend their money. Of course, now it's an upstanding restaurant and bar that you can go and visit. Those who walk by the place often look up into the windows only to report seeing the ghostly image of what appears to be a flapper girl or a lady of the night that worked up in the location. The old hotel is thought to be having guests that refuse to check out even after death. It's also in the upstairs that people see this lady of the night. Yet when you go up there, you'll see it's completely empty and filled with storage. It's also downstairs, pictures will move on their own. Staff have to continually straighten them. When they come back in, they're moved around. I've spoken many times at Billy's. Most of the staff have more stories than they could ever imagine. So when you go there, just inquire about the ghost stories and you may get more than you bargained for. But sometimes these stories aren't always accurate. If you read any books about Minnesota hauntings or watch any documentaries or God forbid you consult the internet, the story you'll hear about this place goes something like this. This is the old heritage house in Embarrass, Minnesota. The story goes that many years ago, in a harsh winter, the father went crazy. He snapped. A family lived in the house and he went psychotic. You know how people in Minnesota get in the winter. So when spring came along, he had lost his mind. He went down to the river where he told his son that Jesus was able to walk on water. You should be able to walk on water as well. And he made his young son walk into the dark, cold, churning waters of the Embarrass River where he drowned. And now the legend tells that if you park your car on the bridge, not only will you see the ghost of that young boy, but many claim he'll act like a siren in the water, trying to entice you in, saying things like, "Help me, I'm drowning, save me." Legend is, if you're foolish enough, he'll pull you right under to your watery grave. But this story is not quite accurate. Here's how it really happened. Back in the late 1800s, a family did live in this house. They were Finnish immigrants called the Fahala family. And unfortunately, in the early 1900s, one of their youngest boys, Billy or Willie Fahala, did indeed drown in the Embarrass River. But when I dug up his death certificate, it had the cause of death as accidental drowning. In fact, years later, one of his own brothers wrote a book and devoted a chapter to the book. Werner Fahala wrote that his brother died in a rafting accident. The boys had skipped school to go rafting and he drowned. Not only was the father not involved, he didn't even know that they were skipping school. But that hasn't stopped the story from progressing and moving. Now it also includes the old homestead. Legend is if you go inside the place, which you can see has been heavily vandalized and neglected over the years, you'll be chased out of the second floor by the ghost of that murdering father. But my recommendation is if you go there, take one of the official Finnish heritage tours. Most likely you'll get to go in, you won't get a trespassing ticket, or you can simply stay out on the bridge. This is a very creepy area. At night, local livestock make some odd noises, and if you're anything like me, when you take a dip in the water at midnight, every branch or twig that swims up against you is going to have your mind conjuring up images of that young boy's hand coming up to grab you and pull you under. Now, how many of you out there recognize this multi-Oscar winning movie? Well, if you haven't seen this or the 10,000 sequels they made of it, the premise is pretty simple. A serial killer, who also happens to dabble in voodoo, is shot by the police. But before he dies, he casts a spell that transfers his soul into the body of a doll named Chucky. And once he's in there, he comes to life and tries to kill and curse anybody who gets in his way. But we know these stories only happen in Hollywood, right? Well, Hollywood or Janesville, Minnesota. Here you have the infamous Janesville dollhouse. For decades, people talked about the doll that sat eerily up in the window. Some say it was put there because a family murdered their daughter and her soul's in the doll. Others say a young boy committed suicide, his soul's in the doll, or vice versa. There are many, many variations of this legend. The owner, who put it up there for decades, refused to talk about why he had put the doll up there. But what we do know is that for decades people thought the place was cursed. They would go out of their way to avoid the house, because every time they walked by, they would see that the doll seemed to come to life and watch them as they moved past the house. Eventually it became a dare. People would drive by just to see the doll. The dare was that if you drove by or walked by or rode your bike, the doll would come to life and curse you with bad luck until the end of your days. But then the owner of the house died and the doll went missing. People in Janesville were terrified. They thought they'd wake up in bed and find it next to them in the middle of the night. But don't worry, they found the doll and they found a new home for it. And it was a great home, because where else would you put a doll that could kill you? Where else should you put a doll that could curse you to the end of your days? Well, for that, there's only one place to house the doll, and that's at the town's local library. And that's exactly what they did. They put it up in the front window of the library overlooking the town. Librarians told me they were amazed at how many people from out of town came to look at it. But they had to get rid of it because it was too scary. Local people refused to come in to check out books because it was too frightening. So the doll went back to the owner who purchased the old estate. He told me he still has it. He wants to put it somewhere in Janesville as a historical marker of sorts, but people are just too afraid of where to put it. But if creepy dolls aren't quite your cup of tea, this next creature myth, legend, spirit, ghost is one you might not want to know about. It's certainly one you don't want to mention its name, because many cultures believe that merely mentioning the name of this next thing is enough to put you on its radar. That when you go looking for the weird comes looking for you. Of course, I'm talking about a thing called the Windigo, the winter cannibal of the north. It started as a First Nation legend up in Canada, and they knew this creature or spirit, whatever it is, by many different names and many different spellings. But when it showed up in Minnesota, it was very large, and they believed in Minnesota that it was a harbinger of death, that if you saw this thing, it meant that death was coming for you very quickly, much like seeing and hearing the Irish Banshee. One place where the Windigo has been spotted is just east of Bemidji at the aptly named Windigo Lake. It's on Star Island, which makes it an oddity in itself, a lake within a lake. And the island itself is thought to be extremely haunted. There have been several books written about the ghost stories of the island where the lake resides. One of my favorite stories tells of people going out to the island years ago. When they got there, the women set up base camp around the edge of the island while the men went in to hunt for game. When the men never came back, the women got worried and went to look for them. And when they found them, they were all strung up, skinned dead in a tree. The women left the island, claimed it was bad medicine, that they would never return there, that you should not step foot on the island. Other tales tell that when they went back, reinforcements went back to find the bodies, no bodies were ever found. Even more bizarre stories come telling that they would find gigantic holes in the ice of Lake Windigo with huge footprints coming out of the ice walking to the island, as though the Windigo simply came out of the icy waters and walked to the island in search of prey. So back in the winter of 2015, I set off on an adventure, an expedition to Lake Windigo with my two colleagues, Noah Voss and Kevin Nelson, noted researchers and legend trippers. You can't tell, but that's me there in the middle. The reason you can't tell is it's about 30 degrees below zero with the wind chill. For several hours we had to carry our gear on sled and backpack across the ice just to get to the island. I'll give you a taste of what that was like. Well, maybe. We'll see. So we made our way across, and we finally made our way to the island. That's when we set up base camp. My colleague Noah and I decided we were going to spend the nights in our tent for the expedition. Meanwhile, my colleague Kevin Nelson over here, he wanted more of an adventure, so he was going to spend the expedition in his hammock in 30 degree below zero weather. The first thing we had to do was get a fire going, not only for heat and warmth and light, but we had to keep our tallow hot. Tallow is an animal fat, and one of the legends is that you can use hot tallow to kill the Windigo. If you pour hot tallow down its throat, it will defrost its icy heart and it will die. Just how you're supposed to get it down its throat, I'll leave it up to you. But we had our tallow hot the entire expedition. And then we made our way to the middle of the lake. Many believe the lake is inhabited by the Windigo, that the lake is the Windigo. It uses the lake as its kettle. Legend is that parents do not allow their children in the summer to walk around the lake, because the legend is if you walk around the lake, the Windigo will grab you, pull you under, and you'll spend eternity with the Windigo in the lake. So one night when we had a great base campfire going, we decided to go to the middle of the lake and try to conjure up the Windigo. Noah and I walked down there, and at the time we were filming. And while we were filming, Noah paused and said, "Our boots are crunching the snow too loud. Nobody's going to hear what we're talking about. We need to be quiet." And when we stopped, something on our left startled us and got our attention. Let's take a look.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for...
What is it?
Don't have it. Don't have eyes or anything.
Let's take another look.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for...
What is it?
Don't have it. Don't have eyes or anything.
Now, most likely it was a deer, or a big bird of prey, an owl, something. We didn't see anything. Now, owls have a long history of being associated with the Windigo. Some say that owls are the Windigo in a shape-shifting form. Others claim that the owl acts like a spy for the Windigo. But even though we didn't see anything, it got our adrenaline going. So much so that my colleague Kevin Nelson slept with his axe right next to his hammock just in case the Windigo appeared. And this story is a great example of how legends sometimes seem to be portals, that not only do you get a haunted legend, you get a bonus as well. And that's exactly what has happened at our next location, Pipestone National Monument in Pipestone, Minnesota, a sacred area. Many cultures quarry to get the stone that they use in their ceremonial pipes here. Many believe it's red, literally from the blood of their ancestors. So when I first went to Pipestone, I was staying at the haunted Calumet Inn downtown, an old haunted hotel right across the street from the county museum, which is also thought to be haunted because of numerous artifacts that it has inside the building. The hotel itself is thought to be haunted by several spirits, including an old lady of the night, a flapper girl that worked there back when it was a bordello. She's been seen many times and will vanish into thin air or walk right into a wall and disappear. Others believe the place is haunted by the ghost of a man who lost his life in one of the numerous fires that have taken place at the hotel. But everywhere we went in Pipestone, townsfolk said you have to get out to the monument. They believed it was haunted. They claimed that when you walk the trails out at the sacred area, you could see and hear the ghostly image of a woman singing. Oftentimes she's more heard than seen, and people think maybe she's there in a ceremony or paying her respects to a loved one, but they never find the origin of that voice. They follow it, but it can never be found. Others see the ghostly image of what appears to be a native man dressed in full native regalia. But he too often vanishes into thin air and can never be found. But I was excited to go there because they believe something else lurks out at Pipestone. Something that couldn't be there. Something that shouldn't be there. But yet many people claim to have seen it. So what are these people seeing? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. These creatures, typical straight out of folklore, gnomes, fairies, goblins, trolls, the hidden folk, the good people, the sprites. You know, 3.5 feet, 4 feet tall, pointed ears, pointed cap, straight out of folklore. When I was over in Ireland looking for these creatures, I would walk into a pub and say, "Where do all the gnomes and goblins hang out?" And they'd say, "Which ones do you want to know about?" But over there, they believed these things had supernatural powers, that they could take your sight, your hearing, or even your life as they lulled you into their dream world and you were fairy-led to their realm and you would never return. So they advised me that when I went looking for these creatures, that I should bring an offering, whether it's some tobacco, a shiny rock, some candy, something to appease the spirits of the little people so they do not haunt you or take you away. So when I was staying at the Calumet Inn, it was a beautiful sunny afternoon. I walked out to the monument and I found a spot where I thought, if little people exist, this looks like a great spot for them to live in. So I sat down under a tree and put out my bait, my offering, some M&Ms, and I called out for the little people to make themselves known. Nothing happened, but 15 minutes later, it felt like something fell out of the tree into my hair, an acorn or a branch or something. But when I went to look, nothing was there. 15 minutes later, the same thing happened. Then, as I sat there on this beautiful day, I all of a sudden felt very sleepy, like if I didn't stand up, I was going to doze off. Perhaps it was the little people lulling me to their world. So I stood up, left, and went to the visitor center. Immediately I was refreshed. I don't know if it was the air conditioning or something else. But I started talking to some stone carvers that worked there. They're the cultural ambassadors, answering questions about their work and their beliefs and the like. I started talking with one woman who had been there many years. Her mother, several decades, working there. She told me most often they would hear what appeared to be their pipes rattling in a back locked room. And when they'd look in, they'd see the little people scurrying about as they turned on the lights. She also said the most common thing that happened to her and her mother is they'd be working when all of a sudden it felt like a fly landed in their hair, like somebody was tugging at their hair. She believed it was the little people playing tricks on her, tugging and pulling on her hair. Perhaps it's the same thing that happened to me out when I put out my offering. But before I left, she said, whatever you do, do not call out for the little people, because the little people will make themselves known to you and they will curse you. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was just out there calling out for the little people, but luckily, knock on wood, I'm still here today. But I want you to keep in mind that not all monsters tend to look like this. In fact, some monsters are even scarier than this, because some monsters in Minnesota, well, those monsters are more human than monster. This is Glensheen Mansion, the historic Congan estate in Duluth, perhaps the most recognizable home in all of Minnesota. And here you have a murder mystery right out of the board game Clue. You see, back in the 1970s, Elizabeth Congan decided to donate the place to the University of Minnesota. She didn't feel any of her loved ones could afford or maintain the upkeep on the house. But she had in her contract that she could stay there until the day she died. Little did she know, less than a year later, the Grim Reaper would come after her. While she was sleeping in her bedroom, she was smothered to death with a pillow, while her nursing assistant was beaten to death with a candlestick holder on the staircase. Right away, they did not want to talk about the grisly murders. It didn't help that the media was turning it into the death house. The reason they didn't want to talk about it is they wanted to open this place up as a tourist destination, someplace you could go and take a roadside attraction. But even though they wouldn't talk about the grisly murders, over the years people taking tours would often contact me asking if I had ever heard anything odd about the mansion. When I asked them why, they usually told me one of two types of stories. The first, they'd be walking on the tour when they'd go into a bedroom and they felt like they couldn't breathe, like they were suffocating. But as soon as they walked out, they were fine. They'd walk back in, same thing would happen. Others would be walking up the steps where the nurse met her in and felt like they were going to vomit or throw up. One woman recently told me that she had been on a tour back in the 1980s. That's when she got sick on the staircase, sat down and let the tour go on without her. As she sat there, she saw what she at first thought was a tour guide dressed in a period costume like a 1950s or 60s nurse. That is, until that nurse vanished right into thin air. The woman was convinced she had seen a ghost. After one of my programs in Duluth, a gentleman came up to me and told me he ran the security company that monitors the mansion's alarms. And he said 2 to 3 times a week the alarms would be triggered and he'd have to go there. And when he'd get there, he'd find that all the doors and windows were secure, no animals, no intruders. He believed it was the ghostly spirits of those women who met their end there so many years ago. But my favorite story came from a young man that was up working on the top of the building one day, up on a ladder. He was doing some maintenance when all of a sudden he felt someone or something tug on his foot. Well, he knew no one could have snuck up the ladder without him realizing it, so he turned around just in time to see a human hand disappear from his foot. He immediately got down off the ladder, went home, and refused to go back to work. He was too scared. I talked to his supervisor, who told me he was a great employee, but he simply was too afraid to come back. We didn't know it at the time, but since then I've received many reports of people who claim that they felt like someone was tugging on their pant leg or grabbing at their ankle while visiting the mansion. I've collected so many stories about the mansion that the next time you go there, instead of counting the number of pineapples through the house, you may want to count the number of spirits in the house as well. But as I'm running low on time on this program, I want to end on the most common report I receive. Because the overwhelming majority of people that contact me about hauntings, it's not about untimely deaths, suicides, accidents, murders, mob hits, serial killers. It's about their home being haunted. Some of them believe it's a relative haunting their house. They smell grandma's perfume on the anniversary of her death or grandpa's cigar on his birthday. Others have no idea who or what is haunting the place. Believe it or not, some are okay with it. It doesn't bother them. They don't care. Others will do anything they possibly can to get rid of the ghost or spirit. But if you take any story away from today's program, this is the story I hope you take away. Because later tonight, when all of you put your head down on your pillows and you hear the wind rustling outside your window, I want you to ask yourself, is it possible, just maybe, that wasn't the wind and maybe you're living in a haunted house as well? And with that, I want to again thank the library for having me here. If you want more information, my website, chadlewisresearch.com, has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here today at this program. Grab one of my books. Go on your own adventure in Minnesota. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I once again want to thank the library for having me here. It's very rare that you can come to a program like this at no cost. Check out a wealth of information from the library. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here, and they should be applauded. I can't think of a time in history in which the library has served a more important function than it does today. With everything going on with the pandemic, societal issues, politics, the library is the fabric that keeps our community together. They are a real treasure for any community that has them. So in honor of the library, if you want to get a book or books from my website, type in the coupon code LIBRARY. You'll get 15% off any or all of my books. So again, I want to thank you all for coming. And please keep an eye out